Yeah, I'll grab them.
Okay. All right. Mr. Eddington, your presence is requested.
Sure.
Boy, these chairs are low. I feel very short for some reason.
That's how I live.
Sorry. It's a tall table and we are not. Well, good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Daniel Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress. I feel like I'm shrinking at this table. Sorry about that. Thank you all for coming. We're having a conversation around reform of congressional oversight of the intelligence community, and I am pleased to have two phenomenal panelists. Starting on my far right, just for entertainment value, is Pat Eddington from the Cato Institute. Pat is a policy analyst in homeland security and civil liberties for Cato. He spent a decade on the Hill as a senior policy advisor for Rush Holt with the national security portfolio. Prior to that, he was an analyst for the CIA for a number of years, and he was also in the Army Reserve. And Pat, I think, knows just about everything, so he's a good person to ask questions of. And next to me is Mandy Smithberger with the Project on Government Oversight. I actually don't know her title, but she seems to do a bunch of everything with a particular focus on national security. She was a former national security advisor for Representative Jackie Speer, and was also with the Defense Intelligence Agency, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. See, I did my homework, guys. There you got it. And just by way of my background, so Daniel Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress. I've been there a couple of years. I was with CREW. I was with the Sunlight Foundation. I worked at the Congressional Research Service, giving you all really bad legal advice on national security matters. And I was a Hill staffer as well. So as you can see, we have no experience whatsoever. To start things off, the purpose and the value of this conversation, of course, is we can all see what's happening in the news right now with the functionality or dysfunctionality or the issues that are arising in the context of the House Intelligence Committee. So a number of us and a number of other organizations have put out recommendations in 2016 on a bipartisan basis with the focus of improving congressional oversight of national security, and we did it before we sort of entered the current kind of politicized environment that we're seeing right now. And the focus of this conversation is to talk about where things are working well, if we can find any examples of that, to identify areas where things have not been working as well, to provide people sort of a basic grounding in why HPSCI exists in the first place, and also to address sort of the congressional oversight process and where there are some challenges or weaknesses, and maybe touch a bit on the institutional role of Congress. Now, this sounds like a lot. But I promise you what we're going to do is we're going to have sort of a quick couple rounds of a conversation, and then we're going to leave a lot of time for questions, because that's always the most interesting part for folks, is getting their questions answered and not just hearing me ask the questions that I'm interested in. But I'm going to start with that anyway because it's my panel and I can do that. So we'll start with Pat. See, my shtick doesn't work here. Oh well. So we're going to start with Pat. So why do we have HPSCI? How did that come about?
So without taking you all the way back to the Continental Congress and the origins, essentially, of the American classification system, for most of the history of this country, you had a circumstance whereby you didn't even actually have a formal classification system. It really didn't start to become a genuine thing until World War I, not surprisingly, when you began to actually see Army intelligence, Navy intelligence begin to use these kinds of classification boxes and things of that nature. And it began to get more formalized over the course of the next several decades. Congress was, for the most part, a bit player, if it played at all in this process. And that came home to roost, that mistake came home to roost ultimately, as a result of all of these domestic surveillance programs that were illegal and warrantless domestic surveillance programs that were run by the FBI, believe it or not, the Secret Service Division as well. They were actually much more involved than most people realize, certainly in the first half of the 20th century. And my former employer, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and so on. So when these scandals really began to break at the beginning of 1971, you had a series of these revelations that took place in 1971. And then that led to several committees, Mr. Ervin's committee in the Senate beginning to take some interest in this, but it wasn't until you actually get into the Watergate period that you get both the Watergate and then what became known as the Church Committee in the Senate, and then in the House, the Pike Committee, to actually look in a structured, formalized way at exactly what the American intelligence community and federal law enforcement had been up to for the previous 60 or 70 years. And at the end of that process, which revealed massive surveillance abuses against literally millions of Americans over the course of those decades, Congress basically arrived at a decision that it needed to create a formalized structure for dealing with this in the House and the Senate. And so in 1978, they created these committees that we have today, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And they have been charged for, wow, I guess it is 40 years now, virtually 40 years now, of keeping tabs on these three-letter agencies and what they do. Not simply what they're doing overseas, which most of us are probably okay with most of the time, but the concern about what they might be doing here and what they can legally do here. Part of the framework for that, of course, exists in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was originally passed in 1978 and which has been amended on a number of occasions, and we can get into that in a little bit more detail. But that, in brief, is kind of the history of how we got these two particular committees. Now, what makes these committees unique is that the staff that serve on these committees get a level of clearance that the average House staffer cannot get. When I worked up here, I was only eligible for what I call the old vanilla top secret, right? That's not useless, okay? If your member is willing to get you cleared, every House office is authorized to have at least one staffer cleared up to the top secret level. It can still be very valuable if you need to talk to GAO, for example, about doing some classified work for your boss, or to get briefed on some classified work that they have done. But the coin of the realm in this town is information, and the most sensitive information is almost always held in human intelligence, or signals intelligence, SIGINT channels. And in order to be able to get access to that stuff, you have to have what's known as Special Compartmented Information, or SCI, clearance. And under the current rules of the House, only committee staff on armed services, HPSCI, government and oversight and reform, and the Judiciary Committee and appropriations are authorized, and probably Homeland Security. They're a latecomer to this. I don't want to leave them out. It's those specific committee staffs that actually have the authorizations. In the case of the Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Committee, they will also have what are known as Special Access Program, or SAP clearances, for some very specific DoD programs, some of which are intelligence related, some of which are operational, which I can't obviously discuss in an open session like this. So that's the basic structure that we're dealing with right now. I'll just leave you with this one thought so we can move on to Mandy and Daniel. When you have that kind of centralized control over clearances and access to information, it puts the average member and the average staffer at a very serious disadvantage in terms of trying to actually understand how these programs work. And when I say programs, I'm just going to use FISA as an example. It can really put your member behind the eight ball. We can get in, and we will get into that in more detail as we go. But that's kind of the basic framework for kind of where we are today.
Great, thank you. So, Mandy, so Pat brought us up to the 70s, late 70s, disco, that kind of stuff. And HPSCI had a reputation for sort of functioning properly for the first sort of decade, and then the wheels seemed to come off. I'm going to throw you on the fire. Is HPSCI functioning as intended? Is it serving the needs of the House? What can you talk about? What happened, or where some of the deficiencies are?
Sure. So, unfortunately, I would not say that it is functioning well right now. I mean, we're really seeing the peak of partisan breakdown. A couple of the concerns that we've had is, one, how it's even chosen who gets to serve on these committees. Speaking as a former personal office staffer, the idea that you won't be able to staff your member well either without that kind of clearance is essential. I think part of the purpose of having a committee is the diversity of views that you have from the different members so that they can pursue different parts of the intelligence agencies and where there might be waste or abuse. And when you can't serve your member well because you can't go into any of the relevant briefings, I think that's where you really see that kind of oversight breaking down. The other thing that I would also just highlight, and generally, POGO is concerned that congressional oversight is not as strong as it needs to be. We think that you guys all need more resources and more staff, and we have an oversight training program to try and help all of you to be more effective in that capacity. But it's particularly bad for the intelligence committees because for some of these things with oversight and government reform, civil society can kind of help to fill in the gaps. We're really not able to do that because of the classified nature of the information. In addition to establishing the select intelligence committees, the Watergate era also brought inspectors general. In the case of the intelligence inspector general, most of those IGs have been vacant for a long time. The CIA IG vacancy has been for about 3 years. DOD IG has been for about 2 years. The ICIG has been vacant for about a year. That makes those offices less effective. So where they're supposed to be helping to fill in that gap for Congress, they're deficient and weak as a result.
That's helpful. So,
and if I could just jump in and make a couple of points there. One of the differences that you see in the legislation that created the House and Senate Intelligence Committees is that in the Senate, they actually have individual designees who work on behalf of the individual members. Now, those designees have to be approved by the chairman and the vice chairman or the ranking member. But as a matter of senatorial courtesy, it's largely unheard of that somebody gets denied if a member puts them forward. And I think what that has done, and I can definitely say this in the case of the torture report, that Senator Feinstein and her staff were responsible for ultimately bringing to us, at least the 535-page executive summary, largest executive summary for a report I've ever seen. It was the fact that she had personal designees working for her who were able to go and compile the necessary data in order to make that report possible. So that's an actual real-world functional example of the kind of dichotomy that we have between the House and the Senate right now. There's simply a lot more centralized control here in the House on the part of leadership. And I want to make it clear, it's a bipartisan disease. You know, Ms. Pelosi has behaved no differently on these matters than Mr. Ryan or any of their predecessors.
That's helpful. And just to lay some sort of groundwork, so when we're talking about designees, what we mean on the Senate side is that every member of the Senate Intelligence Committee gets to pick their person that they hire and that they fire, who is paid for through committee budget, and they're considered committee staff, and they have access to everything, and they function as part of the committee. On the House side, you don't have that. What you have is every single staff person who works for the House Intelligence Committee is chosen by Mr. Nunes or Mr. Schiff. So when Mr. Nunes, for example, recused himself, all the staff were the people that he picked, and they were still reporting to him. So that didn't change the nature of the way that functioned. And the same thing would have been true if Mr. Schiff were to have to temporarily step down as well. And for all the other 20 members of the Intelligence Committee on the House, they all had to rely on the information that came through the people that were hired and fired and report to Nunes and Schiff. And I should say that there are 2 ex officio members of the House Intelligence Committee as well. That, of course, is Speaker Ryan and Ranking Member Pelosi. They get staff designees. They actually have a person with the highest level of clearance who sits in all the committee function, is able to operate on in that kind of way. So you do have designees in the House, but it's only for the 2 ex officio members. You don't have it for the people who are members of the House Intelligence Committee itself. I think that was sort of an important point to tease out. One of the things that's been in the news recently, and people have really confused this, is why and how the House and or the Senate on its own could release materials that the executive branch has deemed to be classified. And I'm hoping that if you're interested, that maybe each of you could both talk, and I'll start with Mandy and then to Pat.
Oh, I think Pat should.
Or we can do Pat first if you like. Could talk about why is it important that the House have this function and the Senate have this function, and why is it not declassification? Why is it something else? And if you could just talk about that just a little bit, I think that would be useful, because there's been a lot of confusion on that point, particularly in news reports of late.
Yes, an enormous amount of confusion and misinformation in that respect. So Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution is what you need to take a look at in order to kind of understand where Congress's fundamental authority derives with respect to classification. And that specific clause basically says that Congress has the ability to make secret its work product. They reference the journal specifically, but it applies ultimately to any congressional work product, and that, of course, has been in the Constitution from day one. As I indicated at the beginning of our little chat here, when the classification system in the executive branch began to come online during World War I and expanded over the course of the next several decades, you had a circumstance where essentially the Congress de facto delegated the ability to kind of classify this stuff. Now, if you talk to somebody like a John Yoo or David Eddington, they will tell you that this is an inherent Article II authority. I will tell you that there is no word in the Constitution of the United States that says the president or any executive branch official can classify a single piece of paper. Now, there are specific statutes that have been enacted over the course of the last several decades. The Atomic Energy Act probably being the most prominent one, which actually created a formalized classification system for nuclear-related information. So that's kind of a primary example. But on a day-to-day basis, what Congress has generally done is let the executive branch essentially engage in these classification activities, create Executive Order 12333, which kind of governs the overall use of classified information and its distribution and all the rest of that within the executive branch proper. The confrontation over who has the ability to release this information really kind of came to a head during the Church and Pike Committee eras, when we had a circumstance whereby on the Senate side, Senator Church of Idaho, who was the chairman of that select committee, made it clear to the Ford administration at the outset that while he and his colleagues would listen to any objections that CIA, NSA, FBI had about the inclusion of information from them in their report, the committee retained the final say about what would actually be included in their report that they would make public. Mr. Pike on the House side thought he had the same arrangement with Mr. Ford, but Mr. Ford, once the Pike Committee report was basically finished, essentially declared the entire document to be classified and essentially demanded that the House not release it. And Mr. Pike, unfortunately, was unable to get his colleagues to go along with a vote in the House in order to essentially meet that condition. In my judgment, the Speaker of the House should have told the President to pound salt and made it clear that how the Senate goes is how the House goes, and that they were going to release the report regardless of what objections the President might have. That brings us kind of the present day with respect to the Nunez memo and now the Schiff memo and all the rest of that. The House, in the wake of the intelligence scandals of the 1970s, and as part of the reform effort that created HPSCI and SISI, included a provision in the rules of the House, which has been carried forward in every Congress for the last probably 40 years, that creates this procedure whereby if the Intelligence Committee basically says we want to release some stuff that may have executive branch originated classified material in it, we will give the President 5 days to weigh in writing with any objections he or she may have. And if the President comes back and says, I object, the House can then turn around and basically make a decision about whether or not they want to proceed with it. If the President does not object, then the material goes forward. I personally believe that provision in the rule should be struck. I believe it should be made clear that the House has the authority under Section 1, Article 5, to release what information it deems necessary in connection with any congressional investigation or oversight activity. I'm not going to hold my breath that that's going to change in the next Congress, but I think if the House were to do that, it would get it back in line with the Senate. Just one quick point about the torture report. I think that's the mistake that Senator Feinstein made. I think she would have been better off saying to the executive branch, following the Church Committee example basically, saying to the executive branch, these are the classified documents that we want to deal with here. We want you to declassify these because you are the originating agency, and we'll respect that. But we're only going to give you 30 days to do it, and at the end of those 30 days, if you haven't done it, we're going forward. Instead, she submitted the entire document, the entire congressional work product, 6,000 pages, to the executive branch for review. That's why it's not public today. And I think that's a lesson that you and your bosses, in addition to the Pike example I talked about, that's what you really need to take to heart.
That's helpful. And is there anything you want to add to that, Mandy?
And just to really put a point on the fact that Congress should not consider itself subservient to the executive branch, and it's essential for you all to reassert Article 1.
Well, that's right. I mean, Congress has it has oversight authority. It has the ability to control through appropriations. It has the ability to demand whatever information it wants. At one point, there still is inherent congressional authority, which has been used in 100 years to demand information, and if they don't do it, then to go and literally put in prison people who do not follow it. There is statutory authority where they can both criminal and civil sanctions to go and compel information. So Congress has a lot of tools that's available to it, but it largely does not take advantage of those tools that exist, for a number of reasons, including like sort of, the rise of the imperial presidency with World War II, and Congress has taken a backseat to a lot of these things. And just sort of put this all in context as well. From 1985 until today in the House, there are 1,000 fewer House committee staff than there was. There's between 2,000 to 3,000 fewer GAO staff. There was 7,000, now it's like 4,000 or 5,000. CRS is down by 100 staff, my former agency. Library of Congress is down, I think, by 1,000. Personal offices are functionally down by 20-something%. So when you look at Congress as an institution, it has significantly fewer people that are doing the policy-related work than what it had before. So if you want to understand why it's weak because it made itself weak. This was done as part of a political bargain in part in the 90s to go and empower think tank and outside lobbying groups. This was part of the Gingrich Revolution. This is part of what they did. They also killed off like the Office of Technology Assessment. So if you want to understand how technology works, well, too bad. The entity that had the expertise that could do this does not exist anymore. So there was this effort to weaken the way that Congress functions, but this is sort of part of a longer trend of weakening the number of staff and increasing turnover rates, not paying them as well as the executive branch. And you can see the consequences of all that's happening today. Intelligence is a particularly pointed example. So one or two other things that might be useful there. There are about 4 million people in the U.S. with clearance. There's about 1 million people in the U.S. with top secret or higher, of which half of them are contractors. Can't tell you how many people in Congress have clearance. I don't know the answer to that question. Top secret compartmentalized, fingers and toes maybe, or maybe the fingers and toes of the panelists up here. Like, we're not talking a lot of people. So when you're talking about oversight, so you've got, Mandy and I, it was 30-something people on HPSCI?
Yeah.
So they each get, was it 1 per intelligence, 2 per intelligence agency?
Yeah, about 2.5 or
right. So it doesn't make any, so you have a person who's responsible, maybe 2 people responsible for the CIA. So there isn't even like a fair shot of being able to engage in appropriate oversight just because they don't have the people and the resources that they need. And do you want to talk about the letter a little bit, where we pushed to get more money for HPSCI?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So we led a letter to advocate for more resources, and we did get a little bit more resources,
30%.
For about 30%. Yeah. So that's enough to hire like a staffer or 2 is what they did with that, which is, more than what they had. But yeah, it's just really not enough. And one thing that we haven't kind of gotten to yet, at that level of staffing, the ability of the committees and, of course, for personal offices to get information from whistleblowers who are going to be the ones who are really telling you what's going on with these programs. It's not going to be the briefings from legislative affairs that you're going to find out what's wrong. You just don't have enough people who are going to be able to receive that information. Most people don't even know how to work with whistleblowers who are going to provide classified information. And those are the whistleblowers that are going to be the most vulnerable. It's so easy to accuse someone of mishandling classified information and then suddenly their clearance is revoked and their job is gone. One of the things that we've advocated for is creating an office to help provide that kind of guidance so that you would be able to receive those kinds of whistleblowers. But we've even had there's all kinds of gamemanship that happens even when you have someone with a HPSCI, where we had a Senate Judiciary Committee staffer who was working with the whistleblower. And it turns out that the Army claimed that his information was compartmentalized secret information, so he had to get read into that program to be able to get that. That was about a 3 or 4 week delay to be able to just find out about something that was happening in a secret program.
Maybe, aren't you supposed to go, you're not supposed to talk to the personal office, if it's secret, right? You're supposed to go and talk to
the committees, yeah.
So you get to go to, so if you're whistleblowing against DIA or whatever, you don't go to your member, so you don't have your member advocating for you. Right. You have to go to the Intelligence Committee and, trust that they're not going to, that they're going to treat you properly, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
So the one thing that Daniel did not mention is that I am, in fact, a national security whistleblower. It has been over 20 years, so it kind of seems like a lifetime ago. But I was actually in this position as a CI employee when I discovered that my agency and the Department of Defense were not really telling the American public the truth about what happened during and after Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm during our first foray into the Persian Gulf, and that this was why an awful lot of American veterans were actually sick, because they had been exposed to low levels of Iraqi chemical agents. And when it became clear to me that there were folks at the Pentagon, all the way up to the level of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who knew perfectly well that we had a problem here and they were trying to kill it, I spent a lot of time compiling classified information from the wartime period, because I had worked that entire period when I was at the CIA. And I took about 100 classified documents up to the Senate Intelligence Committee in March of 1995, and I laid them in front of both the majority and the minority. And this was just a few weeks, literally, I think about 10 days before the new CIA nominee, John Deutsch, who would later, by the way, almost go to jail for a classified information violation and infraction. But in any event, I laid out for the committee staff exactly the kinds of questions they should ask, and they did absolutely nothing with those questions. What they did do, as I subsequently learned, is they called my masters back at CIA headquarters to let them know that I had made a visit. That is the peril, I think, that an awful lot of whistleblowers ultimately face and have to be concerned with, is whether or not these committees and the staff you're dealing with on these committees have effectively been captured by the agencies that they are charged with overseeing. An awful lot of staff that are on these committees, I'm not just talking about House Intel now, I'm talking about armed services, all of them. They wind up coming from these agencies oftentimes. They've done tours over there. The other thing that I have a deep and abiding concern about is the use of detailees from executive branch agencies on committees of oversight. I understand the basic rationale behind that, which is facilitating the passage of information, getting a greater insight, if you will, into how the agencies operate, but it can also go exactly in the opposite direction. That individual can wind up essentially being a mole for their parent agency, because where are they going back when it's all done? They're going back to their parent agency, right, when this is all done. So that's a really, really big problem. But when we talk about whistleblower protection, which is what Mandy's organization spends all of its time basically doing, you have a real disconnect between HPSCI on the one hand and the Oversight and Government Reform Committee on the other. And all you have to do to see the difference, and then I'll shut up, is go to their homepages, right? So if you go to the Oversight and Government Reform Committee homepage, you're going to see one particular link, one particular icon on that page that you won't find on HPSCI, and it says blow the whistle. Okay? It gets down to that level of mindset and mentality about your mission. Oversight and Government Reform, ultimately, the culture is about unearthing bad things going on in agencies and trying to find a way to correct them. That is not ultimately the culture in the House and Senate Intelligence Committees in the main, unless a specific member really gets a bee in his or her bonnet to try to do something, aka Senator Feinstein and the CIA torture program.
Mandy.
Oh, just to put a finer point on it, not only is there not a link on their website, every time we have tried to strengthen intelligence community whistleblower protections, they are the ones who have killed those provisions. So they are not trying to get that. It is just, Pat's right, it's just a totally different culture as to what their mission is as a committee. And it's all the more important that you have staff designees to provide a check.
So, and with that, we'll go to questions from the audience. I should have warned you guys so that you could be thinking about questions in advance, but I didn't do that. So I can keep asking questions because I've got lots of questions, but I want to give people an opportunity. And all of a sudden, nobody wants to make eye contact. Yes, sir.
Sure. Ian Staples with Congressman Susan Davis. Listening to it, I kind of tried to put it in some buckets here of stuff that wasn't addressed. And I think one of the big ones is that I get pushback. I've been pushing this in the House side from the HASC angle, is literally just physical infrastructure. So, you know, now the Department of Defense and the Intelligence Community rely on massive computer networks to do everything. You know, there's like 5 now. And we don't have a single one in the House. We do everything on paper. We do everything in file cabinets. And we do everything in 4 or 5 skiffs. So there's physically not enough space for personal staff to even participate. So not only do you not know what documents you need to review, but if you need to review them, you have to schedule time with a committee staffer to sit with you to review them, because there's not space or time. So that's another issue. So the physical space and the sort of electronic space. And you know, a fundamental problem from a personal office perspective is that, as you laid out, the people who make the decision, leadership, committee staff, they don't have a problem. So they have no incentive to fix this whatsoever, because, you know, the leader, the speaker, have a designee. Why would they need to fix it? They have access. And then just the fundamental sort of mistrust of personal office staff. I mean, I've heard it said multiple times, well, you're fine, but what about this other person? You know, do you really want them to have SCI access? Is that really relevant? Is that your choice? You know,
As if there's not a clearance process.
exactly, as if there's not a background check.
And I can think of members of HPSCI that have given me pause in terms of, I mean, I won't.
I can think of chairman of HPSCI.
Well, I
I
mean,
can think of chairman of HPSCI who've gone to jail, actually. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
so, you know, well, and there's also, the ambassador to where is it now? Is it Netherlands?
Oh, our good friend Pete Hoekstra.
Yeah,
He's having some issues.
Yeah, apparently the media kept calling him out there on his misstatements. I'm being charitable about what was happening there, until finally he had to admit that he was misstating the facts, which is probably not what you want in a person who has anything to do with the committee that's got the word intelligence in its name. So you've got three questions here: physical electronic space. People, so like an incentives problem, so leadership has it, so why should they let the hoi polloi get access to it? Sorry. And finally, sort of a mistrust of personal office staff. Pat, you look like you've got that look in your eyes.
So the infrastructure issue, in fact, all these issues that you're talking about, they boil down to a need for rank and file members to actually care enough and be fired up enough about these issues and these problems. To go to the speaker or to go to the minority leader and say, this stuff is changing or there will be problems, right? That, at the end of the day, is what it takes. You know, the one thing I will say for Nancy Pelosi, at least in the decade that I spent in the Democratic caucus, is that she does tend to listen to her members. That's why I think the Dreamers have been stabbed in the back. That's my phrase. If she had actually listened to the members, I think you would have had a different outcome there. But anyway, that's a separate topic. She listens to members. So if enough members come to her and say, this has to change, you'll at least get that kind of going on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, the problem is the existing Republican leadership is very much in the tank with the national security state, as those of us in the libertarian community, I think, like to refer to it as. And when they have more of a neocon type focus, and I think that applies to Mr. Ryan, I think that applies to Mr. McCarthy, you know, that's a tough thing. That's why having a Justin Amash and a Tom Massey and a Jim Jordan and those guys in the House Freedom Caucus, that's when it really does become important to have those guys, you know, sounding off on this stuff and trying to find a way to change it. I know they want to try to change it. You know, we just need more of them. I will say that when you have that progressive libertarian confluence in the House, some amazing things can really happen. Just to give you one example of how things can actually change, in the 2013-2014 timeframe, this is like right after Snowden came out, that's when you really kind of had your peak moment for trying to reform some of these surveillance programs. And it was an amazing thing to watch in the House of Representatives as Mr. Amash on the Republican side and Ms. Lofgren on the Democratic side managed to get 291 of their colleagues to support them on an amendment to the DoD appropriations bill. 293 to 123 was the vote on that particular amendment, which would have stopped FISA 702 backdoor searches, at least for a year. That's a veto override majority, okay? That was real bipartisanship. It is possible, it can be done, but you need enough rank and file members to get fired up about this stuff to actually go to their respective leaderships and say, we're done with this.
Mandy?
I would agree with all of that. At least some of the conversations we've had on the physical infrastructure, I mean, those are challenges, but not really insurmountable if you care at all about trying to overcome them. So I think it's, very doable. You guys are just agreed to a gigantic budget increase. It would be, pennies on that. And then as far as distrusting personal staff, so yeah, as I mentioned, there is the clearance process, and then it just, it's another place where it just fundamentally rankles me because those members are the democratically elected people, and they chose their staff, and these are people that they trust to handle these issues. And members just need to stand up for their own prerogatives. They're elected, committee staff or not.
Yep. So let me give you a couple things that may be even more concrete than what you already got. So one is that eight of the 9 Democratic members of HPSCI, all of them except for Representative Schiff, wrote a letter a couple years ago saying that they wanted staff designees on HPSCI. And if they couldn't get staff designees, they said that they wanted to have at least their personal staff have clearance. Now, Schiff didn't join that effort. He said that he supported it, but, whatever. There may be Republicans also who are supportive of that effort who are members of HPSCI as well, because the rank and file may have a different perspective than their leadership. So that's one. Two, in terms of physical infrastructure, the House and Senate together spent just a little shy of $1 billion on the visitor center. And there's the O'Neill building. I think there's still the O'Neill. There's the Ford building. There's another building whose name just escapes me. That's the former FBI building. So the House and Senate have a lot of space to do these types of things. This is a matter of priority. This isn't the same thing with the technological infrastructure. There's a lot of actually high-speed connections through the different networks that run underneath the Capitol. This is doable. How do you do it? There's a couple ways you can do it. One is through the appropriations process, amendments in subcommittee, amendments in the full committee. Right? All you need is a member on the full committee. We've seen things get through the full committee that you can't get through the subcommittee to do this kind of stuff. People look at it, they're like, yeah, I think I should have access to this. So that's one approach. Second approach is the Committee on House Administration. You only have a handful of members there. If you have good members there, and I think we've got some good members on that committee, that is an opportunity to go and move resolutions through to address these types of things as well. There's also, finally, the rules process. So every 2 years, the rules come up for a vote on the floor. Each caucus goes through its own conciliation process. The Democrats and the Republicans do their own thing. You can get things through the party caucus or conference if you can get enough folks to agree with you at that point. And that is often a good way to sort of push things through as well. So there's a bunch of sort of institutional opportunities that are built in. Of course, Congress is very centrifugal. There's a lot of force pushing people away from each other. But there are those types of opportunities that do arise. And of course, there's also these there's the NDAA and there's other bills that go through that, that there's always the opportunity to stick something in there. In fact, the requirement to know how many people in the executive branch have clearance was something that someone stuck on at one point to the NDAA in 2010 or 2011, and that's how we have that information. So it's often possible to sort of slide things in under the radar. I just want to say, so it's physical and electronic space. People who mistrust their personal office staff. I can't read my own handwriting anymore.
The people who are in charge don't want to change anything.
The people who are in charge, yeah. And the other thing is, so we're going to see leadership transitions. If not now, then soon. People get on and get off the committee. There's ways of building roads with people who are likely to be the future leadership. So that's often an opportunity as well. So
a lot of Republican committee chairmen who decided that they don't want to do anything up here anymore. So there will definitely be some transition.
Yeah. So other questions? Folks, you had 4 minutes to think of other questions. Not a single. Okay. I mean, I can ask additional questions. So, you sure? Yeah. Okay.
This isn't a very narrowly tailored question, but I think specifically in the House, we've had a lot of turnover with staff. There's going to be enormous turnover next Congress.
Yep.
Regardless of who ends up being the majority.
Yep.
When you're a new staffer and you come into this, it's a very intimidating process. You don't even really know that you could request a security clearance. You don't know that you could request that your boss go and view classified documents.
Yeah.
What are maybe some ways, whether it comes from inside the institution or outside, that you kind of reach some of those new staffers to say, hey, here are things that you can do to ensure that your boss is, overseeing the things that are important to your constituents.
It seems like a perfect question for Mandy.
Well, yeah, I will plug our Congressional Oversight training seminars, handbook, pogo.org/COI. We have lots of resources on how to conduct oversight over the intelligence community, how to work with whistleblowers, and all of those kinds of things. That tends to be, I do think, unfortunately, I think our materials are probably the most accessible for finding some of that information. There are CRS trainings as well. The Constitution Project has put together a tome.
Sorry about that. That was my fault.
But that has a lot of that information. But yeah, as you're kind of acknowledging, there's not really a great onboarding process for new staffers to know all the powers that they have.
Can I make a suggestion
Yeah.
on that? Maybe you guys have a really great alliance of left and right groups that
We should do trainings.
or even just reach out by email. Like
Yeah.
when the new Congress is in, everybody's kind of freaked out in January and running around
Yeah.
crazy. But in February, maybe saying like, hey, who handles this issue in your office, and making sure that they know.
Yeah.
Here's some resources, or here to answer questions. Because I think it's a little bit like you don't even know to ask
Yep.
if you don't know.
No, that's right. So just Pogo does a number of trainings that Mandy mentioned that's useful on a wide variety of issues, and they'll bring in experts and also sometimes people like me to to answer some
Yeah.
questions. The report that Constitution Project put together has actually examples in the back. I'm sure you may have seen it. So that was my doing. Mort Rosenberg, who wrote it, worked at CRS for 40 years. So when I was at the Constitution Project for 30 seconds, I hired him to go and do that on the outside. So that's very useful. The internal one is useful as well. There's outside experts that can be helpful, but yes, I mean,
No, I mean that's great,
but we need
Right.
but we need to do more to help
to
to help.
that it's there.
Yep, and there's a duty I think internally inside Congress to try to. We spend a lot of time trying to think of how the institution can help itself. So I did want to go back to one thing that came up before. So Pat and Mandy had talked a little bit about the process for release. So just to give you an example, when you all came in, there were both letters and also a 7-page recommendations that was put together on a bipartisan basis about how to strengthen congressional oversight. Just to give you an example of how we sort of work through some of the details. So for example, on the issue that's currently in the news, the current way, of course, is that it requires a majority of the members of HPSCI to go through this process. We actually would have lowered the threshold. So that you could have had a 1/3 of the members of HPSCI would have been able to vote to release material that was classified. The president would have had an opportunity to weigh in. It would have come back out. If the president says no, HPSCI would have sent it to the floor, and 1/3 of the floor could have sent it out. And it would have just been HPSCI. It would have been other committees with jurisdiction as well. And there's a reason for this. If you have the majority and the minority, or if it's not a majority, it's not partisan, right? It could be other subsets who think something is so valuable. You want to have the threshold set high enough that not everything comes out, because not everything should come out, but low enough that it's a real threat, that you can actually go and push things out. And it does a couple things. One is it forces the executive branch to engage in a real conciliation process. It takes it out of the HPSCI-only bottleneck, so armed services could do it if they have jurisdiction, oversight and government reform could do it if they have jurisdiction. So you have other folks that are able to sort of get involved in this process. And if you had that result, we wouldn't have had what we had over the last week and a half. Because you wouldn't have had Nunes being like, I'm going to release my thing, and the Democrats, well, I want to release my, you wouldn't have, they would have either reached an accommodation, or more of it would have come out, or maybe would have seen the underlying FISA warrant, or maybe, there would have been the need for people to actually work with one another in a way that they, it would have actually been institution strengthening. It would have strengthened Congress vis-a-vis the executive branch, because right now we're like this, and we need to have it more of a level playing field. So there are many other recommendations that sort of go in there. Everything from HPSCI doesn't have an archivist, so they don't keep track of the letters that go out and the communications that come back. That's astonishing. That doesn't make any sense. There's a whole library that's just across the street. You could borrow someone whose job it is to keep track of those kinds of things. There's several thousand people. This is not a hard thing to do. It's possible to keep track of how many people in Congress have clearance. We think that that's actually done, but we don't know those numbers. We know it for the executive branch. So why can't we know that kind of information? Why can't we figure out how much it costs to give a personal office staffer the right level of clearance? How long does it take? Does it take a year to get clearance? Is it a couple months? These are things that are that can be useful for other members of Congress and for the general public to know, because it helps us sort of push this process forward. So, sorry, I had to get on my soapbox just a little bit. Are there other questions from the audience before we move on? Okay. Well, I think with that, we've kind of covered the playing field. We're happy to stay afterward and answer questions that folks might have. If you haven't taken it, there's the Hill article that Mandy and I and Phil from AEI wrote together about the designee question, as well as the underlying report, and of course, we're easy to find as well. I know you're all tired. Many of you were probably up pretty late last night, so thank you so much for coming out.
Especially on a Friday afternoon.
Especially on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, and we really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank
Nicely
you.
done.
Thank you.